So today we're going to be looking at a painting, and it is called The Mystic Nativity by Alessandro Botticelli. And we're going to go and have a look at it, and hopefully the people who are, I'm going to edit the introduction out, but hopefully the people who are going to see this video are going to maybe be surprised at the Christian imagery that lies deep within many of these medieval paintings. And the language and the literacy to approach these type of paintings, even amongst some of our best modern day art critics, is totally lost because they don't understand and get the biblical references anymore. That has been lost because we're a post-Christian society in the Western world totally. But I do hope that you too get something out of it, and it may surprise you that when we come to this painting and have a look at it. So if we can have slide one up, please. So, yeah, there we go. We'll go in and look at the detail of it as we go along, and you'll probably have a better image you can see. But it would seem at first sight that it's quite fitting at this time of year. I've got a sort of Christmassy image for you, haven't I? And this picture has, in a sense, become almost like a symbol of Christmas because it's been used on Christmas cards for well over a century now. But it has the fascinating title of The Mystic Nativity. And you can go and view that painting today if you want. It's on display in the National Gallery in London. This painting sits, though, on the boundary between the historical reality of the gospel narrative, but also it contains what we would call prophetic imagery. Once you start to look at this painting in detail, everywhere you'll see things, well, rather unexpected things turn up. So, when looking at it at first sight, you might ask questions like, what are the angels doing here? There's more than the angels who just appeared to the shepherd. Why is the sky opened up above? And why are the little devils running on the ground? I know of no devil showing up at the Nativity in my Bible. Are you aware of that? And who are these people embracing at the bottom of the image? And who exactly is embracing who? Well, we've got on the face of it, magi to the left, shepherds to the right, and a sky full of angels. So far so good, but there's also mixed in some images of demonic images, characters running around. So obviously, Botticelli, at the time he painted this, is wishing to draw our attention to something new and to something different here. And it's really almost bizarre that this painting has become used as a Christmas image because it's not actually a Christmas image at all. It's not dealing with a Christmas subject at all. In reality, this picture is about the end of the world, as revealed to Botticelli by the preaching of a prophetic teacher in the medieval church. So, let's have a look at the detail and see where we'll start. Can I have number 2, please? We're right in the center of the painting, the part of the painting probably some of you are familiar with or will have seen before, the manger and the nativity scene. And this is the bit that often gets cropped and put on your Christmas card. And you can identify the figure of Mary kneeling down at the center, and she's got this bright blue coat on, and she's kneeling in a gesture of almost prayer in front of the Christ child, who's rather sort of sweetly, isn't he, kicking a leg in the air as on an arm, as if he's sort of trying to respond to her. Now notice how Jesus is he's been leant over and he's almost been watched by the ox and the horse. And some have pointed out and suggested that it's almost as if the animals are breathing on the Christ child to keep him warm. Some have also pointed out that Jesus is clearly not depicted here as a brand newborn baby. It's estimated that he's at least 12 months old as he's depicted. And he's got one hand in his mouth and the other hand is sort of almost trying to reach out as if he's trying to touch his mother. He's almost seemed to try and reach her with, some say, with both his hands and his feet. Slide 3, please. Mary is seen to wear a rose-colored robe and a hooded cloak of ultramarine blue, which was a very expensive color to paint in those days, and her hands are raised in prayer. and she gazes down at the baby, and her face is shown in profile. Now, profiles from that era, as early as this, are generally depicted almost more like the flat side of a coin. But this is why Botticelli is recognized as one of the masters of the era, because these figures that he's painting in profile are almost three-dimensional. If you look very closely, and I hope you can see the detail, the nose of Mary has a slight reflection on the light of the bridge, and she has flared her nostrils, and her lips are slightly parted. And all of those techniques are used by Botticelli to create that sense of three-dimensional depth. But if you come very closely in, you can see the halo above her head, and that is what is called shell gold, actually created by crushing shells and mixing it with gold and glue and paint. Slide 4, please. But if we pull out again and look at the green part of her robe, I hope you can see that the shell gold is also picked out on the material of the robe as well. The figure of Joseph is sitting on the left of baby Jesus as we look at it, and often many have pointed out that he almost appears exhausted. Perhaps he's even asleep. He's a guy with a balding head, and he's sort of watching over the baby half asleep. Okay, slide 5, please. Then just to his left are the three wise men who kneel at the edge of the scene. The oldest of the three is at the front, and he's the one with the I would call it today a hipster beard, the luxurious beard, and he seems to almost have a smile on his face towards Mary and the child. And then if you look at the back of the three, not the furthest back, but the one who's at the back of the three positionally, and the one in the yellow cloak, his eyes are open and his mouth is almost slightly open with an expression of wonder. And to the right of the manger, on the other side of the painting, we see the shepherds. So they've also arrived. Now, one very effective way to try and understand, the position and the pose of characters in a painting is to try and imagine or put yourself into that pose yourself and see the sort of mood, the sense that it creates. And if you were to try and act out these poses and imagine yourself kneeling as these figures are, I would suggest that it gives a sense of humbleness and simplicity rather than often the grand presentations of normal nativity scenes where people come bearing gifts and come with a sense of pride and honor perhaps and worship, yes. But here we have a real sense of humility which has been recognized and taken up in the way the characters are positioned themselves in the scene. They're not kneeling or standing in elegant ways, like the way, not even like the way of a courtier before a king, but rather they appear more as just ordinary folk who have come here and are seeing and are witnessing something extraordinary. Both the wise men and shepherds are being escorted by angels, do you notice? And they're falling on their knees. You can see that the shepherd kneeling closest to us is the one with a thick red robe. He has a belt round his waist with perhaps a money bag hanging from it. But if you look at his left foot and look at his shoe, it is broken to the point where his toes are poking out. So there's a symbol of the humility amongst these people here. Now, the wise men, normally in a nativity painting, the wise men and the kings are used as an excuse for the artist to show just what a brilliant painter he is by showing how he can paint the hair in furs, he can paint jewels with reflections in them, and he can represent really rich, wealthy types of cloth. But these people in this picture who've appeared at this nativity scene are very simply dressed, and the main gift they seem to be bringing is worship rather than stuff. They're not carrying or presenting, even the wise men, fancy caskets of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then there's the center itself and its manger. If you look carefully, you can see it's actually is it a manger? Because it's actually been built in front of an opening, a cave. And if you peer beyond Mary over her shoulder, you can see that beyond her is a grove of trees. What is lost today for many historians and art critics is the meaning of Christian iconography, which was certainly known and part of the inspiration for the paintings of those times, which isn't picked up a lot today. You see, the cave-like structure would immediately, for a Christian, bring to mind the tomb. That's what it should call to mind in the mind of the believer. And even the figure of the Christ child itself on his arm, and unfortunately you can't see it. We were hoping to use Google Arts Live today to stream a very high resolution image of the photograph, but we've not been able to do that. We're just using some as high resolution images that I could get. But there is a mark in the shape of a cross on the, almost like a tattoo, but it's a mark within the indents of the skin of the Christ child up here on his arm. So there are lots of call forwards here to the crucifixion. And if we continue that line of thought, maybe we see that the white sheet that the Christ child is lying on, partly wrapped in, could have associations with the burial cloth. So there seems to be at least future suggestions here of crucifixion and death. I think we're on to slide number 6 now. This is where it gets interesting. Look up now to the top of the painting, that's where we're at, and you get to see some stuff that's rather weird and wonderful, because what it shows is not only a circle of angels, 12 angels in fact, but they appear to be sort of encircling in a way that suggests an upward movement, a raising up. And if you look very closely, you will see that there are ribbons fluttering, and you can imagine that there's almost a breeze as they circle and move their way back heavenwards. It's almost as if it's a sort of balletic rising up dance as they go up to air. So this takes this nativity scene in the center, something that is very familiar to the Christmas imagery, and it makes it rather, how can I say it, otherworldly. The way they circle almost seems, in my mind, to create almost and say, look, this is the parting of the cloud. This is an opening. This is a portal into heaven itself. And I think people testify to the fact that the artist has chosen to fill that portal area, that vault of heaven, with glimmering, glowing colors of gold. So you see, the sky isn't blue above the angels. It's a rather glorious type of gold. The angels' bodies, if you look, are absolutely half in heaven and half on earth. The upper part of the body and the lower part of the body are divided between this world and the world above. It seems to me, I love the way this strange image at the top of the painting, it seems almost as if the clouds have been pushed apart, and there above it is the golden vault of heaven itself. That's the idea that's been depicted here, I believe, here. Let me just read to you from 2 Corinthians 4, 16, 17, because this is where I believe Botticelli is drawing his imagery from. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command and with the voice of the archangel and the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so will be with the Lord forever. So within this dome space with the angel circling, with this extraordinary expanse of gold, which is actually painted using gold leaf attached to the painting, is this image of heaven. Of course, gold has always been used as an image to represent heaven and eternity and the rewards therein, because gold will not tarnish, gold will not rust, it will not be corrupted. It never loses its color, it remains forever. And that is the idea, of course, behind the kingdom of heaven, and why I believe Botticelli used gold in his depiction of that glimpse of it. So we've got a flickering, encircling, glimmering portal into the sky, and almost like a troop of these 12 dancing angels. So this is definitely no longer your normal nativity. Now, I'm right at the very top of the picture, but the oddest thing of all appears right at the very top. Can we have the next one, please? There is a strangeness here, but thankfully for us, there is an absolute explanation of what is going on here, and rather conveniently is that inscription at the top, running across the top of the canvas, spilling over 3 lines. There is an inscription which attempts to explain what's going on to us in Greek, and it roughly translates as this. This picture, at the end of the year 1500, in the troubles of Italy, I, Alessandro, that's a reference to Alessandro Botticelli, himself who painted this work. In the half-time after the time painted, according to the 11th chapter of St. John, in the 2nd week of the Apocalypse, during the release of the devil for 3.5 years, then he shall be bound in the 12th chapter, and we shall see him buried as in this picture. So he's explaining it to us, but maybe to modern minds, even that in itself is quite a complicated, convoluted sentence which needs a little unpacking. So we're able to find clues in it to help us interpret this rather curious, unusual activity and why these extra images are added. And this transcription, even when translated, is rather cryptic, but we can dig a little bit and work out what's going on here. And when we approach it and understand this and what it says, we absolutely realize that we're a long way from Christmas at this point. Now, he talks about the 2nd week of the Apocalypse during the release of the devil for 3.5 years. And this, of course, is referring to Revelation chapter 11, the last book of the Bible that is full of apocalyptic visions of the end time. So let's try and make sense of this rather complicated, convoluted inscription and work out what he's trying to tell us. So it begins by saying, this picture at the end of 1500 in the troubles of Italy, I, Alessandro, painted it. So he's adding to this description of when he painted it, exactly, and who painted it. And it's interesting to note that this is the only painting he ever signed. He more than signed it, he said, I, Alessandro, painted it. So he adds the inscriptions that says he signs it, and then he starts talking about the death and translation of what are called the 2 witnesses in the book of Revelation. These are 2 people who testified against the prevailing thoughts of the day, testified for and on behalf of the Lamb, and were murdered by the people and were left dead in the streets for 2.5 days before being translated into heaven by God itself. So Botticelli is taking the translation of those witnesses, the prophetic imagery of those witnesses murdered during the Great Tribulation described in chapter 11 and then translated in chapter 12, and he's transposing that idea and that imagery right into early 16th century Florence, that day in which he lived, and the circumstances in which he lives, when he talks about the troubles that they're going through in that city at that time. The Revelation scripture itself actually says this, but after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them. So these are the dead guys, the 2 witnesses, and they stood on their feet, and terror struck those who saw them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. And they went up to heaven in a cloud, whilst their enemies looked on. Okay, so maybe you're thinking, what in heavens is going on here, really? Well, let me try and give you a little bit of background to what's going on in Florence at that time. This painting was painted in either 1500 or 1501, right at the beginning of the 16th century, and at that time, the mood in Florence was crazy. It had gone through a period of increased hedonism and prosperity for the previous 100 years. But then, with the approaching of the half-millennium, apocalyptic fear started to appear amongst the people because they wondered that there'd been a lot of stuff about the first millennium, and they wondered maybe they'd got that wrong, and was Christ returning, and was the tribulation going to happen in 1500? Now, some of us will probably remember 22 years ago there was some stuff around the year 2000, and there are many, many historical records of the panic that gripped the world at the first millennium in 1000, but we also know that around 1500 some of this stuff was going on, particularly in the city of Florence, for the reasons I'll explain. You see, there are many writings from that time that expressed a concern, a great fear that the Antichrist was about to come and he would appear in the city, and that there would be great pain and great horror, and the events of Revelation would be played out before the people. Now, the fear of God, the righteous fear of God, was harnessed at that time by a young charismatic Dominican preacher who came to Florence from another part of Italy at that time, and his name was Girolamo Savaroni. And when he arrived in Florence, he looked around at those wealthy, luxuriously living Florentine people and how much they loved all their accoutrements and wealth and all the sinful debauchery living that they were living in. And, well, frankly, he worried for the state of their souls. To begin with, no one was interested in what he had to say, because he arrived in the city in 1490. But then, as the years went by, things began to change. Particularly, a couple of concrete events happened at the tail end of the 1400s, which were this. First of all, the beloved leader, the patron of the city, died in 1492, and that marked the end of a period of peace, yes, but prosperity also. And soon after he died, the French took advantage of the opportunity, and they invaded with their troops and took control of the city. And there was no political leadership in place amongst the Italians at that time. And the French quite cleverly took advantage of that gap of power and literally just moved in. And interestingly, it was this charismatic visionary preacher that rose to prominence, and he was the one who went and negotiated a peace with the French army, to the point with agreeing some taxes that they agreed to leave the city and the people of Florence in peace. He managed to convince them to leave. So obviously his influence grew greatly. The shift towards him and what he said then became really focused, because they believed he had effectively saved their city. But he subsequently, from that time, went on to preach more and more, increasingly about repentance and about the second coming, and his congregations in Florence grew and grew and grew. We are told from historical documents that when he preached outside the cathedral, translators and what were called re-preachers, who were given texts of his sermon, stood outside in the crowd and re-preached what he was saying inside the building. And the estimates from that time were between 10,000 and 30,000 people would gather every day to hear what he had to say. Even people who weren't believers and who weren't interested in what the latest fashions, if you like, of what the church was saying, it was said that they came, and many influential people felt the fear of God. They became aware, they said, of the judgment of God on hearing this man preach and his sermons. "Where are you going?" Sacronoli asked. "Are you going to heaven, or are you going to be condemned to an alternative destination?" 7,000 Florentines are reported to have repented every week, and people willingly handed over their luxurious goods for destruction. Savaroli organized, and you may have heard this phrase before, 2 events called the Bonfire of the Vanities. That's where we get the phrase. And he had people going out door to door. Some say they went out as a mob, some say they went out peacefully, it's not clear. And they went round all the elegant, rich Florentine homes and asked people to hand over their goods, these goods of vanities, for their destruction. So people would get rid of their jewelry, their mirrors, and paintings just like the type of paintings Botticelli used to paint, and all the other examples of opulence and wealth. Anything that could be associated with vanity was offered up for destruction. Their clothes, their wigs, their cosmetics, playing cards, all these objects were brought into the great square at the center of Florence called the Piazza del Signora, and they were burned in a huge bonfire in front of everyone's eyes. Experts do say that there's no doubt some of Botticelli's paintings, earlier paintings, would have been amongst the bonfire of the vanities. And I would imagine that for him would have probably been quite frightening, because of course the work of an artist is very strongly associated with the person themselves, isn't it? And to see his stuff being carried through the streets and thrown on the fire might at first have appeared threatening. So it is these extraordinary events that are taking place, or a few years after them, that Botticelli is inspired to paint this painting. So this charismatic, prophetic teacher is preaching elements of the second coming, and he's saying to people, you need to prepare for the second judgment, which is why Botticelli now turns to this apocalyptic vision as a painting. But the question we need to ask is, was this painting inspired by faith, or was it inspired by fear? Now, the popular view for several centuries was it was inspired by fear, and him wanting to give the new regime what they wanted. But now, thankfully, and I firmly subscribe to the belief that it was actually inspired by him coming to faith, and this is why I believe it. You see, in this painting, it keeps trying to give us something different every time we come to it. It reveals itself in stages with little motifs and ideas which at first are really hard to dig out. You see, at the time this painting was made, very much around 1500, the tide had turned against the preacher Savonarola. He'd been deposed as the de facto ruler because, of course, what he taught and preached represented a threat to the economic system of the city, and yet we still know that Botticelli painted this painting after Savonarola had been sort of deposed from his position of power. His preaching suddenly became perceived, once the half millennium had passed, it was now perceived as threatening to the order of the day. But if we look at it, what has been discovered recently is the creation of some texts within it, some words within it, almost a secret code, if you like, which help in the understanding of this work. We should be on number 8 now, which takes that off, right? Okay. Look again at this golden circle of angels in the sky. Do you notice the angels are all holding olive branches? The same olive branches that were held for Jesus when the people thought the second coming was happened and he rode in on a donkey. But if you follow the stems down, you'll see a tiny crown that swings from the bottom of each one of them, and attached to those olive branches are white ribbons that sort of swirl in the breeze. And if you look closely at them, and I'm assured you can see it if you look at a high-resolution image, you'll be able to see the remnants of words. And the words have worn away over time, but art historians using what's called infrared reflectography have shown that each ribbon bears a phrase that comes directly from a famous sermon by this Savonarola teacher, because of course all his sermons were written down by the re-preachers. The text of these ribbons actually contain, amongst the 12 angels, a list of what he called the privileges of the mystical rewards of heaven, which is one of his most famous sermons. So I believe far from reacting out of fear, Botticelli, by this painting, was renouncing his previous pagan-inspired painting. You see, the paintings he would have been painting up to this point where, you see them in the medieval paintings, the scantily clad pagan gods and goddesses. That's what he's putting aside and moving away in. So it seems to me that Botticelli was one of this preacher's followers. He clearly knew his way around the teaching of this chap, and he would appear to know his sermons inside out, to have included text from them within the paintings. This suggests to me that what had occurred to him was an actual change of perspective, an actual different way of thinking. He thought less about painting the pagan gods of the past and more about looking upon the Bible and his own spiritual life. And if we view this painting as being inspired by that situation and the end-time visions of this picture, including all the references to the book of Revelation, we can see, and people now, the majority are accepting that it is in fact about the revelation in the end times and the last judgment and the second coming of Christ. And we can start thinking about this young figure of the infant Christ child here to be seen as appearing in the form of a second nativity, a sign of second coming, an apocalyptic nativity, some have called it. Those references to Christ's death contained within it, the tomb, the cross, the winding sheet, the sign, they're all signs that witness of his second birth, second coming. And now if we head down to the very bottom of the painting, there is the biggest clue of all that this is not a Christmas painting. Number 9, please. There are devils down there, and odd-looking critters on the far right. There's an animal, almost ridiculous-looking. One of them has these curvy horns and big floppy ears, and on the other side of the horns, and that creature has a sort of dumb expression, doesn't he? And these big canine teeth that curl out and upwards. And he's got these extraordinary mad eyes. They're painted with yellow with a black pupil in the middle of them, a sort of mad staring eyes. And you probably can't see it, but if you get really up close and look carefully into the depth of the ground beneath our weird little dog, floppy-eared creature friend with the mad staring eyes, you can see a little devil almost disappearing from view up the road beside the foot of the worshipping, the embracing angel, running away. And there are also, which you probably can't make out here, there are actually spears probing at the devils, which is, of course, one of the pictures of what will happen to the devils when they are banished to hell, which, of course, in the Revelation is described as a place created by God for Satan and all the demons, not the place intended for man, human men. We don't get sent to devil. We make the choice to. We don't get sent to hell. We make the choice to go to hell and close the door behind us. Also in the foreground of the painting, we come out to number 10 now, last couple. There are 3 couples, each comprising an angel and a human. My own personal take on this is, below all that bad stuff at the bottom, the overall image of the painting here is of a second coming that for Christian believers is hopeful. I think part of what Botticelli wants to show us is at the end, the last judgment for the believers is to be embraced by angels and raised up to heaven. Spiritually, maybe, but that is a sense and mood in this painting. In a very literal sense, we are able to see humans touching the divine. So we'll go out to the last one again, please. So today, 500 years later, this painting still speaks to us, to anyone who's a believer, as a vision of a divine moment. Now, no one will probably ever to be able to fully explain this painting and all that went into it, because Botticelli isn't here today to do that for us. And he did call it the Mystic Nativity, and I think the clue's in the name. But most art historians today now think that this is actually a personal work of devotion. It's an image created by a man of faith who's responding to these amazing messages by this charismatic preacher talking about the end times. And that chimes with me, with what I know and what I've researched about the concerns of the time and the interests and the change of Botticelli's painting style towards the end of his life. But also the inscription and the responses, the little phrases out of the sermon messages, show to me someone who's deeply, deeply identifying with the biblical teaching that he's receiving at the time. You see, Botticelli actually believed that in those 6-8 years after the death of the local governor and the French coming in, it was the beginnings of the Great Tribulation as described in Revelation, and that it would spread and go across all Europe. And it was the intercession of this man that caused the Lord to tarry, to allow more people time to come in. And his use of the phrase, I, Alessandro, personal first name, painted this, seems to me to paint a really close identification of this picture, and with a man who's embracing a new view of his Christian faith. That's why I would like to think of this picture as a picture not made for commission, like these other paintings that he did, which were for people of power and influence. This was a painting by Botticelli for Botticelli, not commissioned by anyone else. But the important thing I would like to say, it is a picture of the apocalypse, but it's a comforting picture of the apocalypse, which is no bad thing, is it? It means that we, if it is the end of the world, the one that's depicted for us, for anybody who embraces the message of Jesus Christ and the salvation of our sins by faith alone in him alone, it tells us that it's okay. It's okay for us, for believers. I wouldn't mind being there at this end times imagery if the truth is I'm going to be embraced by angels and raised up to the Father in heaven. It chimes absolutely with my positive review of the return of Christ as a born-again Christian, as something that need not ever be feared. And I hope it does you too. Okay, that's it. Thank you.